explored the relationality of God and how God continually pursues humanity. The words from the prophet Jeremiah and our Psalter today join this narrative. And in Jeremiah, he recalls when God shared the covenant given to Moses was not to be the covenant given to the coming generations. It was a covenant that had been written upon the hearts of the people and was to consume their being, for it was now within inside them, Jeremiah speaks. It comes across in his words that the covenant of the previous generations had not been kept, and that it was the people who were the ones not keeping it. This new covenant was conveying that God's fidelity to humanity was willing to continue in such a way that it met the people where they were at. The covenants of old were unilateral, God being the one to initiate the covenant, setting the terms and determining how the two parties were to relate to one another. This new covenant seems to be shifting that tradition a bit. This time, the covenant was between the two people, for they were now in relationship with God and responding to that which was on their heart. Jeremiah doesn't say what the changes would include in this covenant other than it would be within the people. It also doesn't know if this internalization of the law meant that it would now be easier to follow, or if it meant that the law now became impossible to escape. These are the questions we are left with as God's people. How does God's covenant of love dwell within us? Does this mean following God is something that will be easier than it was for the times of Moses? If it is within us, is it something we have any choice in? What are the changes to the covenant for our generation? These are the questions every generation will be asking, because God is presently moving within humanity and stirring about a prophetic voice among us. What has been for the generations before us will not necessarily be what is meant for us when it comes to how we are to be God's hands, feet, and voice of the gospel today. If we try to keep things as they are and how they had been for generations before us, simply because that's how it's always been done, we in church know that saying all too well. Why do you do these things? Well, it's how it's always been done. If we continue that, we miss out on the greatest of gifts, the freedom that comes from having the covenant of love dwelling and written in our hearts. A love of being fully known by the Creator of all life, the one who knows what our skills and talents are for a time and place as this. It is a love that allows us to know the adventure of freedom that can only come from being loved completely, unconditionally. That freedom invites us to discern the Spirit moving among us and what it is drawing forth within us to respond at this time. Having the covenant of love written on our hearts and dwelling within our very beings does not mean the discernment of God and what God is calling us to will be easy. Often we want what is easy or guaranteed because we don't want to get it wrong with God. That's why we sometimes want to keep doing things the way they've been done, because there's less to be risking. And in some ways it feels as though there's a certainty that comes with it. We at least know what we're going to get. And there are certainly times when following the wisdom of how things have been need to continue to be. But that should never come at the expense of discerning what God is asking us to do and being called to do in this time. And if we don't want to risk our current identity because we don't want to allow how things continue to be to change because we can't control it, we miss out on what God is bringing forth. Discernment with God is not easy. It's not this outline that we get to follow. It's not you pray, you seek guidance from a mentor, you pray some more, God answers, and you know what to do. Maybe sometimes it goes that way. How wonderful would that be? But discernment with God is a dance. to dance with the Spirit moving within you, within your very soul, and you dance along by responding to what it's creating within you. That often means the process will look different for every season in our life. That spiritual practices that engage our discernment process may not be the same for each of us, but one constant is the need among those discerning to be committed to the process. Discernment is not something to pass off as just another thing in our day, but it is to be a practice that needs focus, consistency, and dedication. That includes the discernment we go through as individuals and as a church. Having the covenant within our persons doesn't make this journey with God any easier than it was for Moses and the Israelites. But it does mean that the journey is equally needed and life-giving. The covenant of love is within every person from the beginning of creation. God, as noted last week, does not force us to respond to it by obedience or with certainty, but by simply saying yes. It's being within us reminds us that we have the chance to be in a relationship with God, and that the chance to respond is simply already within us. And that this response will be different for each generation to come. Even if we are someone who responds to God, it doesn't mean we will be the flawless disciple, for there is no such thing. That's where God's covenant is not contingent upon our keeping it perfect or even responding to it the first time around. God saw the Israelites not being able to keep the original covenant. And rather than breaking covenant with them, God changed and met the people where they were at. In doing so, allowing the relationship to be honest and forthright. We today have more insight to God's covenant than Jeremiah did. We have the knowledge and life of Christ. With Christ, we saw the fullness of grace come into being, knowing that by grace and love, we are able to respond to the invitation God presents for each generation. For just as Christ embodied a new covenant within himself, we live into the new covenant of this generation. It is through Christ we know the hope of living in the here and now and the not yet. God is continually reminding us that what is our current situation is one thing, but it is not the fullness of what we are invited to live out. God breaks through this realm of life, bringing forth pieces of heaven. It is through humanity and all of creation these pieces of heaven reside. We can see that there is much more of heaven that needs to come here on earth. So we know this covenant is not one that is forced upon us or one that we are unable to escape. Rather, it is within each of us, dwelling and being invited to respond within our lives, within our churches and generations to come. So heaven has a place to be known within our worlds. In this season of an invitational Lent, we ask ourselves, what is the new covenant being brought forth to Calvary? And is it something that consumes us? Are we keeping our eyes upon the past and wishing it for it to be our future? Or are we leaning into what has yet to come and known for this community? Sometimes it's easier to idealize what our memories have now recalled as the golden years, trusting that it will be our glory days once more. Our past hold great seasons in our lives, but if we believe they are to be the best, we have set limits on what God can draw forth within us and reducing new beauties and new mercies to what has already been. Our past is to be a guidepost and to be treasured for sure. Our past is not to be dismissed or treated as disposable. It is to be honored and trusted. It is from our past that we know who we are in the present. We carry our past through story and scars. The past is to meet us in the present, and it is meant to be built upon. allowing newness to reach the lives within our community, within those who have yet to experience this community. God is always asking the church to trust what has been and invites us to be hopeful for what is to be. So what is this new covenant God is bringing to this community of faith? Is this covenant with God one that inspires our engagement with the world? Is it a fire set within our bones, not to consume us, but to ignite our souls, to breathe unquenchable hope? Just as fire does not consume wood or metal, but those elements reach out to the fire to become one, we reach out and are consumed by God's love, not to be washed away, but to enable us to love those we meet with an all-consuming love of Christ. Responding to God's covenant is not something we do when we feel like it or a lackluster desire. Responding to God's covenant of love is one that is to be in first in all we do, in how we think about and respond to our neighbors. God's covenant of love is something we are to practice. It is not something we respond to once and then get to sit back and watch God do miracles, or to expect the world to be just about us alone. We are called to be in relationship with our neighbors, and God calls all of creation our neighbors, meaning we engage the world with our skills, talents, and unique expressions of hope, manifesting heaven on earth every time we do. God's covenant does not consume us to squelch our uniqueness, but dwells within us so that it becomes one with us. The covenant of our parents is not the same covenant we are to live into today. Not because God is continually changing how things are to be, but rather engaging the world in its greatest needs. And those needs continue to be experienced differently, which means we experience the world differently. We are not here by accident. You are not a mistake for this time in this place. You were intended to be here. So how do we respond to the covenant set before us and allow all that has been to bring insight and hope to guide us for what has yet to become? I offer you this question I heard from a colleague this week at the American Baptist Home Mission Society's meeting. In this time, in this place, with these people, can we do what God is calling us to do? In this time, in this place, with these people, can we do what God is calling us to do? We need to continually ask ourselves this question, never taking for granted what God is drawing us to be or creating within each of us individually or as a church. Calvary, we, like every church, have a beautiful and needed message of the gospel that is unique to us, and it is our duty to give it to the world. What will that be for this time, in this place, with these people? Whatever our answer to this process of discernment may be, we shall live it by the guidance of the Spirit, strengthened by hope, and encouraged by faith of our ancestors. And may it consume us like fire, bringing forth new life to our community and to our city. A new covenant has been placed upon your hearts. May we discern what it is and live it out, for the world needs you, for you are not an accident, and God is meeting you where you are at. Amen.